my anthology of Leo Frobenius arrived today. It's Leo Frobenius on African history, art, and culture, an anthology. But actually, it's the Leo Frobenius Reader is what it really is. So I'll be reading through that, and we'll be talking about the theories of Leo Frobenius regarding African cultural morphology at a later date. This is a very good anthology, and the only one really that exists in English that represents his theoretical writings. He has other stuff that's been translated into English, but none of it's theoretical. It's all African folk tales and so forth, art. I did want to draw your attention to a paper by Goethe. This is found in the collected works of Goethe. He wrote a paper called The Stages of Man's Mind in 1817. It's just a 2-page paper, but it is also one of the main influences on Spengler, along with The Metamorphosis of Plants and The Birth of Tragedy. I forgot to mention this paper, where he divides culture up into 4 distinct phases, also like Spengler does. A poetic phase, and that would be, of course, the phase of the epics. A theological phase, which would be, of course, the phase of the scholastics and so forth. A philosophical phase, which would be the grand thinkers, himself, Kant, Hegel, etc. And then a prosaic phase, where everything declines just into the ordinary. Realism comes in the arts and destroys everything. So the basic 4-stage morphology is correct. It's based on a transformation, I think, of Vico's 4 stages of the age of the father, the age of the sons, the age of the people, and then the ricorso. I think this is his translation of that. I'm going to read the paper, even though it's maddeningly vague, because he doesn't give any specifics, but it's short. He says, the primeval phase of the world, of nations, of individual human beings, is the same. And here he's referring to the Dark Age intervals. At first, everything is enveloped by a desolate void, but the spirit already contemplates the creation of the animate and inanimate world, while the primitive masses look about with fear and amazement in search of the barest necessities. A more advanced spirit gazes at the great phenomenon of the world, perceives what occurs there, and gives utterance to what exists with profound awareness, as if it came into being before his very eyes. Therefore, in the earliest stage, we have the contemplation and the philosophy of nature, the defining and the poetry of nature, all in one. So now we move into the first stage, the poetic stage. The world gets brighter, and the obscure elements become clearer and take on outline. Man reaches out in order to gain mastery of them in a different way. This new man surveys the world with a simple, healthy sensuousness, which sees nothing but itself reflected in things past and present. He gives new shape to old names, anthropomorphizes and personifies things and beings living and dead, and imports his own character to all creatures. Thus primitive faith lives and thrives, and often recklessly rids itself of all abstruse remnants from the primeval epoch. Poetry flourishes, and only he who has innate primitive faith, or can acquire it, is a poet. This epoch is characterized by a free, robust, serious, noble seriousness, which is elevated through the power of the imagination. So the imagination is the faculty, and he has 4 different faculties that correspond to each of these 4 world ages, and the poetic age has the faculty of imagination. Now we're going to move into the theological phase, where reason, that is to say, Vernunft, comes in. Then in the philosophical phase, he's got the intellect, that is to say, Verstand, will come in as the primary ruling faculty. And then in the merely prosaic phase, what Spengler will call civilization, sensuality comes in. Everything gets degraded to the level of the senses. All right, so moving into the theological phase. But since man knows no limit in his pursuit of self-improvement, and because the enlightened aspect of existence is not always to his liking, he longs to return to mystical experience and searches for a higher power behind the world of appearances. And just as poetry creates dryads and hamadryads and makes them subjects of higher gods, so theology creates a hierarchy of demons that are envisioned to be ultimately dependent on one God. We may call this time the sacred epoch, although it is essentially a product of reason, Vernunft. The rational spirit gradually loses its influence. Primitive faith is reclaimed, modified to suit the time, and the miraculous is proclaimed to have objective rather than poetic validity. So now here we move into the philosophical epoch proper, in which Verstand, the intellect, begins to take over. This is the period from Descartes to Kant, let's say, in philosophy. To this, the intelligent mind must object, although in its ideal state and form it worships the primitive beginnings, takes pleasure in the poetic primitive faith, and values the noble human need to accept a supreme being. However, intelligent man strives to clarify everything, to find reasonable explanations for even the most mysterious phenomena. To be sure, he does not reject primitive faith and organized religion, but he presumes that they are based on something comprehensible, praiseworthy, and useful. He seeks significance, transforms the specific into the general, and from national, provincial, and even individual traits, he deduces characteristic features applicable to mankind in general. We cannot dispute the noble, pure, and sensible aspirations of this epoch, yet it benefits the talented individual rather than entire nations. So that's the epoch of great philosophy. Then we move into the decline, which is the prosaic epoch. As this attitude becomes more prevalent, it is immediately followed by the last epoch. We may call it the prosaic epoch because its aim is not to humanize the essence of previous epochs and make them understandable to everyone, but instead it vulgarizes the old and venerable. And in doing so, it utterly destroys innate feelings, primitive faith, and organized religion, and even the presumption of the intellect that there is a laudable purpose behind the unfamiliar phenomena. This is the Socratic man now, coming in, destroying everything. This epoch cannot endure long. Man in his need, stimulated by events in the world, retrogresses and abandons the guidance of the intellect. He intermingles religion, primitive faith, and primitive beliefs. He clings to one tradition, then to another. He delves into the mystical, replaces poetry with the merely fantastic, and elevates it to dogma. Instead of teaching prudently and exerting influence patiently, he sows herb and weed indiscriminately. There is no point of reference to guide him. Everyone claims to be teacher and leader, and presents his perfect folly as a perfect ideal. And so, the value of any mystical idea is destroyed, and even primitive faith is desecrated. Qualities that formerly diverged naturally in their development now interfere with each other as hostile elements. And so, chaos has returned, not the original that was fertile and life-bearing, but a chaos of death and decay which even the Spirit of God could not use as material to create another world worthy of him. It's interesting, it contrasts a little bit with what Heidegger said in the Der Spiegel interview, that only a God can save us. It's very, very different from them. So that's Goethe's one-page paper on the stages of the spirit that Spengler, I'm sure, encountered, came across, and became part of his inspiration for the four-stage morphological model of Decline of the West. What I thought I would do here is talk about Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley is the American equivalent of Arnold Toynbee. I don't think he ever read Spengler. It wouldn't have interested him. Quigley was very much a pragmatist. And his model is also a seven-stage model. So with Quigley and Toynbee, we both have seven-stage models. With Spengler and Goethe, we have four-stage models. They're closer to the myth, I think, than Quigley and Toynbee, who are both empiricists. And Quigley's model is kind of a distillation of Toynbee's, and in many respects, he just constitutes a footnote to Toynbee. He's nowhere near as great. His book is The Evolution of Civilizations, which came out in 1961. He had a huge influence on Bill Clinton, as everyone knows. So I want to contrast his model with Toynbee's here. Now, he comes up with this idea, the key idea for him is this idea of an instrument of expansion. Civilizations come up with instruments of expansion, and the earliest instrument of expansion in the West is feudalism, and it is an instrument of expansion because it expands on the technological plane, our knowledge of technology, but it also expands on the geographical plane. There's also a geographical expansion that goes along with it, and feudalism is the earliest of our instruments of expansion, and they have to be able to apply to new inventions on the one hand, but they also have to apply toward the accumulation of a surplus on the other. So they have to be very handy and workable in what they do. If an instrument of expansion petrifies, then it can lead to an age from an age of expansion to an age of conflict. So he has intermittent ages of conflict in the West that can take place if an instrument of expansion petrifies, as feudalism does. It petrifies into chivalry. And so there are three things that can happen. If the instrument of expansion petrifies, then either it can be reformed completely, or it's just circumvented, as the British monarchy was. The British monarchy became an instrument of expansion that petrified in the 17th century, and Parliament was created as a way of just circumventing it, going around it. Or it can react, as in the case of the Counter-Reformation, where the worn-out instrument of expansion, the church there, reacts by becoming a reactionary institution. So those are the three things that can happen with the instrument of expansion. But usually what will happen is a new instrument of expansion will come in to replace it, as capitalism comes in to replace feudalism. So we have these 7 stages, and the first stage is mixture. Mixture is simply the phase of all the different barbarian tribes all intermixing and rubbing up against each other and intermixing. This corresponds to these first 2 stages. Mixture and gestation corresponds to the 2 stages, and expansion. His third stage is expansion. So we have mixture, gestation, expansion. Those all correspond to the first 2 stages in Toynbee's model of genesis and growth. So he has genesis and growth, and then breakdown and decay, breakdown and disintegration. Those are the 4 key phases. And those 4 phases in Toynbee are separate from the other 3, which really aren't phases. They're institutions: the universal state, universal church, and the heroic age. Those aren't really stages. They're outcomes of what happens as the result of the disintegration. So we have mixture and then gestation, which corresponds to Spengler's pre-cultural phase, the gestation of the culture getting up and running off the ground. And then finally with expansion, we get Charlemagne, 750 AD, and we get the Carolingian age. And now knowledge is coming back in. The instrument of expansion is feudalism. Knowledge is coming back in, and there's geographical expanse. Charlemagne creates his empire. He unifies most of Europe at this time. And then this instrument of expansion lasts for quite a while, up until from, let's say, 1450 to 1650. It petrifies into chivalry, and then the new instrument of expansion becomes commercial capitalism. Not industrial, but commercial capitalism, which is invented by the ship traders, the Venetians, the Genoans, who are trading, who are going to India and places like that, and they're trading already pre-made stuff like spices, salt and pepper, silks and ambergris, and all kinds of pre-made objects that come in now, and it creates a commercial capitalist economy, but it is not based on the making of these objects, but simply on the going to get them, bringing them back, and trading them. And that becomes the new instrument of expansion that replaces feudalism now for quite a while. Then by 1650 to 1750, there's a dead period, Toynbee says, in which there's almost another 100 years' war. There's a dead period in there in which things begin to wind down. There's knowledge does not come in the way it was coming in, and the instrument of expansion begins to stiffen and rigidify into what he calls mercantile capitalism. This is its petrified form. So then now the response to this by 1750 is to create a new instrument of expansion, which is industrial capitalism, which is of course created by the British in the 18th century. That becomes the new instrument of expansion that gets the economy up and running again and creates a new age of exploration, of knowledge of the earth, and also of all kinds of new technologies. We get the 19th century technological explosion, and we get the telegraph, we get Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell working out the electromagnetic world, we get the telephone, all kinds of new technologies come in the 19th century as a new age of expansion blooms and expands, and then it transforms into what he calls monopoly capitalism. By the time of the Great Depression, now we have monopoly capitalism, which is a petrification of industrial capitalism. It petrifies and stiffens. It's taken over by mere corporations and giants like Henry Ford and guys like this. And he says then it stimulated an age of conflict with the world wars. And this book was written in 1961, so he says we've been in an age of conflict ever since. So that's his model. That's expansion, and that corresponds to Toynbee's phase of growth. He has genesis and growth. That Quigley's expansion clearly corresponds to Toynbee's phase of growth. And then he has Quigley has the age of conflict, which corresponds to Toynbee's breakdown. And then he has it leading to stage 5 is a universal state, which is a term that is clearly taken from Toynbee. And it's followed by 6 and 7, decay and invasion, which corresponds to Toynbee's disintegration period and the heroic age, the barbarian age. So the two models are very close. They map onto each other quite clearly. But I just wanted to go over Quigley in a very quick way as an American attempt at a bit of cultural morphology, which is kind of clumsy and awkward, very empirical and pragmatic. It's very much the way you would expect an American to do it. So I just wanted to give that model as an American version of the high European metaphysics of Toynbee and Spengler. And even though Toynbee is an empiricist, nonetheless his model is metaphysical thoroughly through and through. It's part of the European metaphysical continental tradition, even though he's coming out of England. Nonetheless, it is still a grand model. And I think there's something rather prosaic and dull about Quigley's model. It really does sort of exist in Goethe's world of the prosaic phase of civilization. There's a certain dullness and lack of imagination about it. He doesn't have much regard for philosophy and the arts and the big things, culture and religion, the things that make civilization what it is. So I find Quigley's model rather small-minded and not very useful in the end. But I thought I would recite it anyway as an example of an American sort of cultural attempt at cultural morphology.